Thank you, sir. I've got three. Oh, we just need to make sure. There he is. Simon's joined us as well. I've got three questions from recognised legal representatives and then 6 matters raised by your own representatives. If we start with those raised by the recognised legal representatives of other core participants. In relation to HIV-infected partners, so non-haemophiliacs, and the access to care and treatment that they have, what support and advocacy is provided and what's needed for HIV-infected partners of haemophiliacs, in your view?
Well, we would be lobbying for equal access for partners as well, because depending on where they choose to go for their HIV treatment, that should be done without question. They shouldn't have to wait on waiting lists, and they need to have priority access as well. Obviously, the numbers are very small, but that definitely needs to happen, and they shouldn't be treated as secondary infected. They are primary infected, and they've suffered equally.
Bill, Simon, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree with Lynne. I think there are issues that need to be addressed to ensure that they are given a very fair and supportive and compassionate treatment, and that they are not left feeling isolated in any way, or secondary or less important in any way. I know from a number of experiences that all sufferers have had within the bleeding community in terms of even dental care going back to the old days. We were treated quite harshly, and we were treated with deep suspicion. I think those days have gone. I trust they have for good. I know practice is much better, but I think it's really important remembering how I felt at times when I was being faced with treatment and by people who didn't understand my circumstances. I think it's really important that we ensure that they are properly facilitated and supported, and that they are clear that they get that treatment and support in the same compassionate way.
So, and also, can I just add something? I think the point that Simon raises about dentistry and HIV, particularly with the HIV drugs and the impact on, on their teeth, they definitely need to have priority, because aside from the stigma and the difficulty finding a dentist, this is an impact of a treatment that they've been given, and they need to have partners as well as infected.
Could I ask you to repeat the question, please?
Of course. What support and advocacy is provided and what's needed for HIV-infected partners of haemophiliacs?
Well, I am familiar with cases in England. I'm not aware of particular cases in Scotland, but in relation to the should word, I completely agree.
Linked to that, in relation to potentially infected families, in your campaigning work, have any of you been aware of any discussion about a look back extending to potentially infected family members?
No.
No.
Which is ridiculous, because obviously at the time when people didn't know they were infected, obviously the family members could have been infected. We know, obviously some partners were tested, but that does need to happen, definitely.
Yeah, when we've been talking in previous times about these sorts of situations and scenarios, people have reflected on that and asked the question, but I can't say for sure that has actually been practiced.
Are you just considering HIV here?
No, I think the question relates to both HIV and hepatitis C.
Well, through personal experience, after I was diagnosed, we had 2 children, and my wife was never tested. And it got to the stage that when our daughter became a teenager, we were in a perilous position. The problem is insurance, because it would have wiped us out financially. if Rosie had lost her job or her income. So it's a very dangerous place to be, and I think, like other parents, I would have found it impossible to live with myself if son and daughter had been infected.
Bill, another question that I've been asked to ask. You referred to the financial review and the presentation from Jan Barlow. What was it about the presentation that convinced you that you wanted nothing to do with the Alliance House organisations?
She wasn't the only presentation we had. We had lots of different presentations, but I don't know if it just simply lacked enthusiasm. We'd had bad experiences. Our membership during the process had bad experiences, and I just don't think she was able to answer the questions in response to the feedback that we'd had from members both of the Scottish Infected Blood Forum and of Haemophilia Scotland.
I would add that I've had correspondence many times with Jan Barlow, and it's never amounted to anything at all. And every time I've contacted her, she would ask for confirmation of who I was, even though I would copy the person that had asked me to resolve a problem into the email to her, and there'd be maybe 2 or 3 emails just confirming who I was, because she didn't know who I was every time I wrote to her.
So that was quite specific about the financial review. Thank
Sorry.
you, Bill. Lynne, I've been asked to ask you about 2 matters. One is, I think, more of a point of information arising from your statement than a particular question. You note in your statement that your grandfather was a haemophiliac who lived until he was 76, and your great-uncle, also a haemophiliac, lived until he was 92.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes. So my grandfather, he worked underground, and in later life he worked on the railways, and he had 7 children, and his brother also. His brother was actually he was a civil servant, and he became the mayor of Pontypridd. And he lived until he was, I think it's 91 or 92, but yeah, whatever I've said in my statement. Yeah, so it demonstrates that, the fact that it's said to us, I've gone to lots of meetings in the Department of Health, and they've said, they would have all, all the haemophiliacs would have died at 23, I think is the number they quote. Well, that's just not true, because our family are living proof. And I know other families in Wales where the grandfather, lived with interventions, but a relatively normal life. They had children, and yet it was the next generation then, the generation, like my generation, my cousins.
In terms of support you've received, Lynne, I understand you've had quite a lot of support from the Irish Haemophilia Society. Again, is that right?
Yeah. So it was in 2015. Well, when I was a trustee, I first met Brian O'Mahony, who's the at the time I think he was the chief executive at the time of the Irish Haemophilia Society, and he was also involved in the World Federation and the European Haemophilia Consortium. And as a trustee, I went to 2 conferences. And Brian basically, presented on advocacy in action, and that's where I looked at their society, and I could see that they'd got the settlement in Ireland, and it seemed to be the best one that was on offer. And basically, he highlighted all the areas of advocacy. He went through his campaign and how they got it, and I replicated a lot of that in our campaign. But basically, Brian is himself a haemophiliac, and also with family members as well. And I would say that when Lord Morris was alive, Lord Morris would go and ask Brian O'Mahony's advice about things, and there'll be examples of that in Hansard, where he's asked Brian O'Mahony to, for advice or to ask for further information about the Irish scheme. And I just feel that the Irish Haemophilia Society in Southern Ireland, it's an exemplar charity, and it's a really good example of how a charity can work. It doesn't need to be infected blood in one area and younger families in the other area. I think it's a generational thing. And I just feel that Brian should be asked to give evidence to the inquiry, because he really does set a very good example of a successful society.
Could I just support what Lynne's saying in terms of the Irish Haemophilia Society being an exemplar? We look at it enviously, because but the qualification I'll put on that in relation to funding is it received, since the Lindsay inquiry, huge government funding.
Bill, I've then been asked to ask you to look at a document, WITN 2287021, a meeting from the 25th of November 1999. A meeting with senior representatives of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service in Edinburgh.
Yep.
I think you did attend. I think your name has been redacted out of an abundance of caution or an error on our part. But you were at that meeting, weren't you, Bill? I
certainly was.
And what was the purpose of the meeting?
It followed. I'm just looking at the timing of this, actually. We were already making this was in the very early days of the Scottish Parliament. We were making representations to ministers by then. And I think one thing that Susan Deakin did do, and I suspect it was probably her that arranged this, in that she, I suspect, instructed these very senior people from the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service to meet with many of us, and for them to explain what had happened from their particular perspective, but also for us to be able to ask questions.
And what did you learn about the possibility of ALT testing as a surrogate test for hepatitis C?
Well, if I can just take a moment to go into my mental filing cabinet here. The context for this was that at the time I'd been working in the world of the environment, where we talked about indicators and the precautionary principle. And by then, I had really hooked on to the whole thing about ALT testing. And the reason for that was the confidence that the days after I was infected, the total confidence in 1986 that my raised ALT levels were confirmation of my own infection. And that led me to be thinking about, well, hang on a minute here. They were able to confirm for me. So the donor, one of those donors in those thousands of blood donations that led to my infection, one donor somewhere must also have had raised ALT levels and had been infected. And that raised for me the whole issue about screening. And that then, during the questioning during this session, it came out from Brian McClelland. And I remember this quite vividly. He talked about raised ALT levels, and his words were, well, we wouldn't have been able to eliminate someone because of possible false positives, because his words were they'd had a good drink in them the night before. In other words, alcohol raised ALT levels. Now, subsequently, of course, we were able to find out that gamma GT is an indication of alcohol. But what also came out of that was that the main consideration had appeared to have been within the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service was volume in terms of blood donations. They didn't want to scare the donors. And that became very evident during this particular meeting.
And what impression did you have of the way in which the SNBTS conducted the meeting?
I think, yeah, a bit defensive, a bit patronising, particularly their chairman, Angus McMillan Douglas, who we later came across again when we appeared in front of the Health Committee.
We spoke about the petition that was proposed, and we spoke about it as being one of the Scottish Infected Blood Forum. It was in fact proposed by the Scottish Haemophilia Groups Forum.
That's correct.
Can you tell us briefly about what the difference between the two groups is?
The Scottish Infected Blood Forum was formed much later. The Scottish Haemophilia Groups Forum was, in effect, an amalgamation of the local groups of the Haemophilia Society in Scotland. I moved back to Scotland in 1996, and I was buttonholed and introduced to members of the Tayside group by a couple who lived close by in Perth, and unfortunately they're no longer with us. And it was very much led by the late Philip Dolan, and he was tenacious. He could be a very difficult man at times, Philip, but he was tenacious. And so the difference is, it kind of petered out. There was a Scottish committee, there was London felt they needed to reinvigorate matters. There was a Scottish officer appointed. Latterly, Philip identified that there was people who'd had blood transfusions were really not provided for in Scotland, and there was a separate charity. But we worked very, very closely with them, and I must emphasise the importance of that particular charity, who are our close partners. We have joint meetings with every, 3 months or whatever. And they did two things in particular that were really useful. Robert, on Tuesday, referred to a bit of artistic work that he did. Well, the SIBF sponsored a similar exercise, but they also then, I think they were funded by Scottish Government to conduct a scoping exercise, which in many ways it came out around the same time as the Penrose report. The bit of artistic work that was done, and I'm sorry I'm a bit tired and can't remember the complete detail. It was important because it gave the opportunity to people who wanted to appear and tell their stories in a way that Lord Penrose hadn't allowed.
Before we come back to the Penrose, which I have another question to raise with you, just to be clear, the Scottish Infected Blood Forum, it is for those who either have been infected because of a bleeding disorder or because of a transfusion. It's both groups.
Yes, we have a crossover. Yeah. There's members in both. I mean, we have people who've come to us in Haemophilia Scotland who had transfusions.
In relation to Penrose, how many campaigners were asked to give oral evidence?
None.
And what was the impact on the infected and affected community of that decision? Well,
in line with the terms of reference, it frankly meant that we didn't get to throw some of the accusations at government that I've just thrown today, frankly, and bring it, or another way of putting it might be, to bring evidence to that particular inquiry. Philip in particular was deeply frustrated. He spent 20 years of his life and he was turned down. I was put forward and equally was turned down.
And finally, when we've heard talk a lot about nothing about us without us.
Yep.
And in that context, what access, in fact, it's really a question for all three of you, what access do you think that patients should have to medical information about them?
I think it's fundamentally important to understand. I mean, what we're talking about is a trust relationship. What we're looking at now is a breakdown of trust. And therefore, there needs to be a balance in how that information is shared, but it needs to be shared. It comes as a surprise to find that one might have spent 10 years being observed with a potential illness that one wasn't being informed about, and then afterwards being assured that in my case, that I definitely had stage 2 hepatitis, cirrhosis of the liver. So those things come as a surprise. I think building relationships on trust is fundamentally important, and that breakdown in trust is something which I think has to be restored, and has to be restored in such a way that it won't be broken again. Perhaps regulation is a way of ensuring that happens by standardizing practice, professional practice. But I think there needs to be an understanding and an acceptance that there's a certain risk in that process, and there needs to be some protection around that risk for those who share that information.
Lynne, Bill, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think obviously, it should be transparent, and I think it shouldn't just be something that government says is going to happen. I think it should actually happen. It's one thing when ministers say in the Lords, I think one of the phrases is, I think it was Earl Howe said this, the absence of patience in the development of services is often a reason, or is always a reason for their failure, and that would be in Hansard. And yet, at the same time, they're restricting services, and it's not being based on clinical need. It's being based on how much the government can afford.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question.
Absolutely. In relation to we've heard lots about nothing about us without us. In relation to the provision of medical information, what access do you think patients should have to medical information about them?
Well, I'm going to chuck something out there. I believe there's a strong case, and we've discussed this within Haemophilia Scotland, for a duty that each time there's a medical document of any significance produced, a legal duty to provide a copy of that to the patient. I'll draw an analogy here. The two most private things in our life are our health circumstances and our financial circumstances. Can you imagine going to a bank and them saying, you're fine? They don't tell you what your bank balance is. They don't tell you what the ins and outs are in your account. That's the situation that we face to this day. And I say this from experience as a patient, which is a very mixed experience. I remember one time I had an endoscopy. At the end of the endoscopy, the nurse took me through, sat me down, gave me a sandwich, and said, right, I want you to sit here and listen to me, and here's 2 pieces of paper I want to take away with you to explain what's just happened and what the results are. To this day, I recently had a bit of a scare, a bit of a chest scare. I had a chest x-ray and blood samples, and I had to ring my own surgery to get the results. So I'm throwing out that out there. I understand there'll be a great wailing and gnashing of teeth, because I've actually spoken to an administrator within the haemophilia world in Scotland, quite a senior individual, and the reaction was, wow, there's clearly a cost to that. But can you just imagine a bank manager saying, can you imagine if you went for private health care? We pay taxes. Can you imagine them saying, well, no, we're not giving you any paperwork to follow up? And if you look at this disaster and medical records going missing, then that's been one of the key issues in all of this throughout the evidence that the inquiries received. The second point I want to make about this is the question of a duty of candour. Yes, Scottish Government's done good stuff on that. 2018, we gave evidence to some of the MSPs in the Health Committee about it because we felt it was important. It's part of the lessons being learned. But it's not at a strategic level, and this goes back to the question of cover-up.
I'm just going to look behind me, see if there's anything else. Sir, do you have any matters to raise?
Yes, the first couple of questions for you, if I may, Bill. Let me just press you a little bit further on the question that was asked about why Jan Barlow's presentation was so unpersuasive. The reasons you've given are that, in effect, it was lacklustre and she couldn't answer questions that were then asked. Now, that's very much a reflection of one person and their reaction. What you were considering, I take it, was the future structure of the health, the arrangements for paying money to those who've been infected and affected. What was it about the AHOs that led you to think that they were not the right vehicle to do that?
Well, the question of accountability, sir. You've received evidence on the H from some of the trustees of the AHOs. I have some experience of charity governance, and much larger charities than ours, with tens of thousands of acres of land, 40, 50 employees, and the question of the impression I've received from that evidence, which is consistent with the impression we received at the time with Jan Barlow, was that in effect they were like NDPBs, but government was able to say that's their decision. I remember in particular there was one bit of evidence about them not going out to fundraise. Charities have to go out and fundraise, but they were reliant, the only source of funding was the government. So in effect, they were NDPBs, but it was convenient for government. Now, one of the questions we were asked during the financial review was, which model do you want to arrive at? And the Minister was open-minded about that. But we reached the conclusion that accountability was important, and the Minister supported us in that. In fact, she's left a legacy, and there are some views in Scotland that maybe it needs to be a bit arm's length, but the legacy was, as I said earlier, we can go back and pin these guys down about the way that the Scottish scheme's being operated.
Thank you. The second question is also about the review of financial arrangements in 2016. When you told us that the Scottish Government came to you and said, well, we'll go with a median wage.
Yes.
27,000. Was there any discussion in that meeting that you can recall about the question of whether any account should be taken of the spouses or the partners or the carers who may have sacrificed their own earnings in order to care for the person who was the primary, in this sense, beneficiary?
I'm grateful you raised that, sir, because the legal definition under the Act in 2000 wrong Act. The legal definition that after the Ross report and the Skipton Fund was formed used the term definition, where we've started discussions with Scottish Government about that very matter. This is 2021. My wife is not my dependent. My God, if I was to suggest that. And similarly with partners. With sons and daughters who were children, it has proven advantageous on occasions in order for financial support to be continued for them. But that is a matter that needs to be examined pretty closely.
The point I was perhaps asking about was, suppose that a partner has lost part of the job that he or she may have done. They may be working part-time 10 hours a week instead of full-time 38 hours a week. They may have had various other expenses which come with that. The person who's been infected has no income because they can't work, at least little income because of their infection. they may be attributed 27,000, and that may add 15, 20,000 to what they already earn. But the partner has also lost, and part of the overall cost to that household is the loss of his or her income.
At that point during our deliberations, that particular point you're talking about in terms of carer, rather than being dependent, being a carer, which is what I think, sir, you're getting at.
It is. It's the costs of caring.
Yes. In other words, if you draw an analogy with litigation in terms of settling litigation care costs, no, that was something we probably missed. And similarly with adult children who'd never been compensated, and worst of all, with parents who'd lost children. So that we didn't, and that's one of my big regrets. But balancing the time imperative that we'd press government on at that point, and certainly I feel, and I'm sure colleagues would agree, that's something that needs close examination now.
The next is really to you, Simon. It's you were explaining that the ideal in terms of future funding arrangements in respect of any form of support, whether ex gratia or whether compensation for those who have suffered, should be paid for out of the HM government funds, central funds. And I understood you to be saying, essentially, there ought to be central funding but local management. Have I got it right?
I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're saying.
Bill, this is for Simon, so let him go first. Then you have your chance on the Constitution.
I think, first of all, I would like to be clear that I believe that central government has the responsibility, because going back pre-devolution, this is a problem prior to devolution, and therefore it's about the responsibility and accountability of that. The other issue is that effectively it depends on the nature of devolved government and the relationship with the United Kingdom government in terms of how monies are separated, divided, awarded, provided in general practice. I know the reality of the situation in Northern Ireland is that if Northern Ireland were to be given the responsibility, and our Minister of Health has said he would be listening and responding positively to the, if I understand him correctly, responding positively to any recommendations coming out of the inquiry. The reality is, no matter how well intentioned he is, he would not be able to provide the recommendation to any level, because the recommendation, I would anticipate, if there were one, would be so significant and substantive that the current budget would be inadequate to meet it, and therefore it could not be achieved. And under those circumstances, I think the responsibility has to fall with central government and the Treasury. How it is finally arranged is not as big an issue for me, to be honest with you. And I think for other victims and other recipients, that wouldn't be as significant an issue. But I can understand, and I can almost hear Bill saying that for him it would be. And I understand, because of the differences in government from where we are at the moment, our government would be looking to central government to provide them with something which then they would be passing on.
So for Simon, it doesn't particularly matter where the sums are administered. Bill and then Lynne, what about Scotland and Wales? What's your view?
Well, Bruce yesterday raised the question of what's this money for in terms of the treatment of people with haemophilia. And he made some pretty strong assertions that obviously the inquiry will look at. I think this is, we've given this a lot of thought, because we get into a whole constitutional wrangle about a post-devolution government and a pre-devolution, when the disaster really all commenced. We're still living the disaster, but the disaster commenced prior to devolution. I've consulted with legal colleagues about this, and it goes back to what was the will of Parliament at the time that devolution took place, in terms of, and I know the Inquiries Act doesn't allow us to look at liability, but in many senses, the Scottish Government has inherited the liabilities of the Scottish Office. But until this inquiry examines those issues, in a sense, I'm sorry, sir, I'm putting this back in your plate, to actually look at what went on within government. I don't think we can answer that question.
So you ask for central funding, but leave it up to me to decide who administers it. Simon says he doesn't mind. Lynne, do you have a position?
Well, I believe the funding needs to come from central government. Obviously, in Wales, we've worked hard to get this holistic approach. But that said, there are people in our group who don't use that anyway. So I think it'll be a question that we put out to our members in our next discussions about how they would feel, if it was centrally funded. I think the features of our scheme, I think, are good and they work, but then there are people in the group that say, well, I don't need that support. I don't need the welfare advice. I don't need all of that. I would prefer to have financial recompense for that rather than the scheme, the all singing and dancing scheme. But I think that would be, I couldn't answer that until we've spoken to everybody about that.
So you're arguing for a local solution, even if it is to accept central management?
Not really. I think we have to have this the facility where there's face-to-face contact and financial support. Psychological support, but I think it just has to be all funded centrally. So, because obviously in Wales we have the scheme in it, and we have it's based in South Wales, but for the people in North Wales, that's 4 or 5 hours away. So it does have a problem of logistics. So in South Wales it's all close by, but for the people in North Wales that's not the case.
So, having had the impertinence to back this back to you, could I ask that there is a further consideration here? The schemes tend to operate on a payment monthly, and that's important, and that was something we considered during the financial review. One thing we never did during the financial review in Scotland was present the opportunity to then convert that off into a one-off payment, such as happens in Ireland. There's a middle house here, because one-off payments in terms of compensation, there was additional money paid at that time, and therefore, and I had a discussion at a senior level about this in terms of whether it's easier for government to pay a whole lot of money at once, or to spread it out over the years. So there is a consideration here about not only enhancement of the schemes on a monthly basis or yearly basis, but also in terms of a capital payment.
Sir Brian, may I make one other point? I think in the context of the experience we've had in Northern Ireland, with a great sense of insecurity around the continuation of government without punctuated breaks that last up to 3 years, if a recommendation came forward and it was the responsibility of devolved government to deal with that, and government wasn't functioning effectively, the experience of the last 3 years indicates that we would be waiting. And that is something which would be totally against the spirit and the principle of a conclusive arrangement. So that influences me in a way that my colleagues wouldn't be influenced, I think.
Well, that's all that I have to ask. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think each of you wanted to say something to close. Simon, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you very much. I just prepared something because I had several thoughts on this, but I will be very brief. And it answers your question originally, Sarah, in relation to my fairly negative conclusion. And thank you for giving me the chance to say something. I was critical of the progress of government in the conclusion of my campaign statement. I highlighted the obfuscations, strategies of delay, verbal assurances, endless meetings and correspondences, which encouraged me to wait patiently while the big cogs of government and the bureaucracy of government ground slowly. But time doesn't wait while process animates itself. Throughout this period of frustration and stress, people were and are despairing and dying. Lives were and are deteriorating. Uncovering the facts about personal harm and injury is a painstaking process. This process is greatly magnified when it is a question of how government deals with the health and well-being of those of us who innocently and haplessly trusted the state to care for us. Both medical and government bureaucratic decisions have turned the infected and affected blood community into victims. We trusted our health practitioners and we ended up as victims. We trusted government on 2 previous inquiries and we ended up as victims. This cannot happen again. I've spent the last 6 years of campaigning metaphorically screaming out that delays are not the way to resolve the wrongs of the past. In fact, the chorus from many campaigners is the same. There's only one practical way to clean up the human trail of emotional and physical debris that lies at the government's feet. That is to acknowledge its existence and to acknowledge that it needs to be put right. As I said to the Right Honourable David Liddington in 2019, there's no moral justification for defending the past when you can correct the future. As I now review the situation after much campaigning and much disappointment, I actually have some hope. I've seen that light has been shone. And process has responded, and issues long fought for have been hard won, but won nevertheless. Parity, whatever that means, is being achieved. And there is acknowledgement that there is a moral obligation on government to clean up the human debris trail by redeeming itself from the horror of the past and the pain of the present. What is only left is the future. Victims in Northern Ireland have tasted the sweetness of acknowledgement and compassion. Only because we have a health minister in Robin Swan who accepted that he should address what others have failed to do. And in so doing, he has proven that when government accepts its moral responsibility, it fulfills its duty to its citizens. What we need is what we have always needed: central government acknowledging its responsibility and acting swiftly, as you once, Sir Brian, requested. So I will continue as one with the endurance and determination to run for miles if I need to, because I stand in a line with all other victims, whether looking ahead or looking back, looking to the left or looking to the right. We cannot give up on ourselves. Thank you.
Lynne.
Excuse me. I feel privileged to be here today, giving evidence to the inquiry on behalf of Haemophilia Wales and the people we represent. The campaign to bring this disaster into the public domain has succeeded because of the continued efforts of victims and campaigners against the orchestrated and deliberate attempts by successive governments and others to conceal the truth. This campaign has truly been fought on the shoulders of giants. They fought the lack of transparency, accountability, and willingness to engage for over 30 years, and we will not forget them or their perseverance. We have heard in this inquiry from those in positions of responsibility at the time who cannot remember, did not keep records, or trouble themselves to understand or accurately recall the details that led to the deaths of over 3,000 people in the UK. The lack of transparency, accountability, and willingness to come to terms with the past to prevent this happening again continues. There remains an unwillingness of some to properly engage with key individuals and campaigners still excluded from decision-making forums. There still exists a lack of transparency of funding sources. To quote the Welsh Health Minister's evidence where, like the medical records, money appears from the back of the sofa. And there is still the lack of accountability, there is still a lack of accountability where people responsible retire to enjoy the benefits denied to the infected and their families. Victims and families will never forget what happened, or the response of those who should have had their interests at the centre of their duties. If they ever thought government was their friend, they now understand it is not. We hope the inquiry will finally get to the truth about what happened and ensure that victims and families receive the compensation and support needed to allow them to live what is left of their lives in the dignity they are entitled to. Thank you.
Bill.
I've got a great big long list of wants. Duty on documents I've talked about, duty of candour. Pharmaceutical hazard fund. In other words, we stop nationalising the losses while pharmaceuticals make vast profits in the cases where people have been the subject of trials. There's an ongoing situation in Scotland with regard to Patient Safety Commissioner, and I remain, and I really do hope that the inquiry can look at what happened in public health terms here, because to me there was a public health disaster and the public health officials were nowhere to be seen throughout this process. So they were the missing bit of the jigsaw that previous inquiries simply haven't looked at. However, I'd like to bring this much closer to home for me. When we met on Saturday, I was chairing a meeting joint meeting of the Scottish Infected Blood Forum and Haemophilia Scotland. I said, folks, how are you all feeling about this? And the message came over, we're exhausted, we're weary, but my God, we're resolute. After that, a widow phoned me and talked to me privately, and I continue to do that, and I'm sure Lynne has a similar experience, and Simon as well. She was really struggling because what was important to her was the need to be believed. She felt that all her power had been removed, and because of that removal of power and not being believed, she felt the need to be able to trust. The thing she really wanted was to be able to trust again. And this is important because this disaster, because of the financial implications and the health impacts, has removed choices. She revealed her sense of vulnerability to me. And we've talked about nothing about us without us, and I hope that we may look at this process in the future. But I go back to how I got involved in all of this. And Robert on Tuesday talked about some names, some first names. And for me, the equivalent names are John and Pat, Philip, brothers Dave and Ian, and also another John. But then there were the men, and they are largely men, there are some women, but there were the men who were the husbands and the fathers that I never met. Dave, Davy, Peter, Tom, Billy. I'm sorry to the widows whose names I've not included, because the list goes on and on. And finally, the wee boys. We need to have a memorial. Bruce talked about it yesterday, I agree, and Robert illustrated what can be done thanks to the Birchgrove group. We need to mark this in time. And yes, we must provide for people, but we must never, ever forget. And one of the main ambitions I have in Scotland, we have in Scotland, and these people who do these things that raise money for this memorial keep us going. They're a tremendous inspiration. So it's for those people that I think we need to continue to act and to continue to be resolute. Thank you.
You may have wondered, perhaps others may have wondered, why today we have chosen to have the three of you as a panel. I think those who are listening will be left in no doubt that in your very different ways you have expressed much of the same feelings, given much of the same evidence, though with regional variations as appropriate to devolution. I suspect that in this way, by having the three of you together, you have allowed the voices that you have said need to be heard to be expressed, if not directly to the inquiry, through you, because each of you represents a body. And it is important to hear the representatives, the heads of those bodies, talking to us on their behalf, as well as on your own individual side. The impact of what has happened on you and on others, but essentially what you've been giving evidence directed to within our terms of reference is the impact on you, on those you represent, on others that you know of, and the appropriateness of the government response. And it's varied, and the expression of it is varied. I think few of us will ever forget your emphatic oratory, Bill, and the way in which you've left us in no doubt as to your strong feelings on matters of principle and your championing of the individual at the heart of it all, whoever that individual may be. Simon, you've expressed yourself in, well, rather different terms, but very eloquently. You described yourself, for instance, in terms that Bill wouldn't, I think, have used today, as less than enamoured on one occasion by a government response. I think you might have put it rather differently. But, and you, Lynne, have always been mindful of the fact that you speak for a community, and you need to be sure that the community are properly reflected in what you say, because they are a wide and diverse group. But I've heard from each of you, I think, and I think you've expressed your own campaigning, if I can call it that, to use a word Bill doesn't like, in terms of you've shown us that it's rather quieter, perhaps, in the evidence you've given than Bill, but there is, I've seen a steely determination running through your persistence in asking questions and waiting for the answers. But each of you, I think, has drawn attention to the need for compassion, openness, the need to avoid delay. On that, by the way, if I can just say, I'm sorry that because of the need to avoid delay, which you've each touched on repeatedly, that there may have been pressures put upon you by the inquiry to respond. It's inevitable, and is one of the reasons I thank you for being prepared to give up your time, not simply in being here today, which goodness knows that's enough of an effort, particularly from Scotland these days, and not being as well as you might be. But also preparation beforehand, which takes a lot of effort. And it's been, I hope, worthwhile for you, which it has for us. But also, I think you've expressed a collective sense of having been wronged and a collective desire for accountability and for a continuing voice. I'd like to thank you for that, for being here to do it, for being prepared to put up with the difficulties of having a panel, having to be quiet at times when you might have wanted to speak, and being conscious of the fact that you have taken different approaches, reflecting your different areas, but giving each of them value in very different ways. It's been a new experience for us to do it this way, but I think it's been worth it. Thank you.
Tomorrow we have Jason Evans giving evidence.
10 o'clock. So 10 o'clock tomorrow.